Now we're going to be moving on to our next section for the evening, which is a panel discussion that is going to be hosted by Senior Lecturer at Abertay University, Darshana Jayemane. He will be joined on this panel by Caitlin Goodale, Ruth MacGilp, and Jade Howe.
Hey, I think we're on. I'd like to thank Mal and the Arcadia folks for organizing what should be an amazing chat. I'm going to keep an eye on the time as well. This is kind of a discussion about fashion, gaming, and the future of both. So very, very pleased to have Caitlin Goodale, the head of user experience at Dressed, who you've already heard from, Jade Howe, who's the head of fashion at Lockwood Publishing, and Ruth MacGilp, who's communications and content manager at Fashion Revolution. So it's bound to be a really fascinating discussion because, just thinking about the way the pandemic has changed, the ways that we're interacting and presenting ourselves to each other. We just had COP26 and issues of sustainability are like kind of foremost in people's minds. I was just really struck by Ashley Wilkinson's work previously about avatars and how some of those sci-fi kind of like worlds are coming into the kind of like our reality. And the crossing over is from both industries that other speakers talked about just before. It was such an interesting group of presentations. So Caitlin's already raised issues of diversity and metaverses and VTubers. So I don't know exactly where we're going to end up, but it's going to be an interesting conversation, I'm sure about that. So I did want to start with Caitlin and Dressed. And for those who don't know, you can explain a little bit about it, Caitlin. Was that something?
Sorry.
Yeah. In a recent conversation, so I'll just put this to you, to try and frame this kind of this kickoff. In a recent conversation, the founder of Dressed, Lucy Yeomans, she started off with what seems like a fair enough point, which is luxury fashion and gaming don't seem to be the most common match that would come to mind. Although if you look at the prices of graphics cards in current generation consoles, you can definitely argue that gaming can be a luxury kind of activity. One area where they maybe have a lot in common is your role, which is user experience. So can you tell us a bit about your work on UX at Dressed, your approach to bridging fashion and gaming?
I can. So at Dressed, we do really sit right in the middle of that. Lucy, as Darshana mentioned, comes from this incredibly illustrious fashion background, and many of our executives do as well. And then you have people like myself who are just big old video gamers. And trying to find that middle ground when we're working with luxury brands, a wide variety of luxury brands on a day-to-day basis, but also making a game that appeals directly to real gamers, mobile gamers who actually are quite hardcore, it turns out. So for me, my background is primarily user experience design, though these days I'm not quite sure what sort of designer I am, because I've done a bit of everything from illustration to graphic design through user research. You'll find me writing Jira tickets relatively often as well. But with me and my team especially, because now I lead kind of user experience for Dressed, we have that real clash kind of at the core of what we do, right? Of figuring out how do you make an engaging game experience that is, all those things that we say about games, they're responsive, they're fun, they're juicy, they're inclusive, they bring you in, they make you want to play more. How do you create that experience, but you also have a feeling of the luxury world? And luxury brands and luxury fashion is something that, as you mentioned, many gamers traditionally might not be super associated with. But I think, to be honest, I think that conversation you were mentioning there was back kind of in some of the early days of the pandemic, early 2020. But I'm sure we'll speak to this today, it's amazing how kind of the luxury industry and also just the fashion industry in general, its response to games and how it wants to be involved with games and digital media, that has already in the last year been totally revolutionized. I think like the conversations that we have with brands these days and also that we have with our players are totally different than they were at the start of 2020. Yeah, on a day-to-day basis, what that means is really having to think about, what like visual styles and feedback we would traditionally use in games. How do we make those luxury? And how do we actually like blend the barrier between the two and kind of push on either? Not that I want to like push Prada and Gucci to tell them what luxury is, but very often I have to kind of also make the case for, yes, and it's really important that we have green buttons sometimes in video games. Oh, you're muted, Darshana. Sorry. And now I should mute myself.
I was just wondering, like, who is it that you're speaking to at these companies that you're working with? Like, who's the person? Like, what are their titles? And I'll talk to Jade a bit about this as well. It'd be really interesting to get that kind of like, who's the person who's responsible in the companies you're working with.
It's a really interesting question, actually, because like within Dress, we actually have almost like an entire arm of the business that is brand partnerships. So people with that really kind of detailed experience of how to work with all of these amazing luxury brands and keep them happy and make work they're happy with. And I think we found, especially when Dress was getting started, you might be talking to someone in marketing or someone in publishing or, kind of different people around the business. Sometimes the CEOs might have a real interest in games and that would be your contact. And that's how you get in and do a collaboration with them. But I think we're seeing more and more these days. I know for a fact Gucci have their own gaming arm now, just people who entirely focus on gaming collaborations and what that means. And I think more and more brands, again, depending on their strategy, are really actually having like detailed roles and people who this is their entire focus, which is great for us. It makes it much easier.
Yeah, and in terms of the users who's playing Dressed, and maybe you can also give us like just a super quick introduction to Dressed itself, like as a platform, and what the kind of like experience of play is, and who's playing it, what's the kind of like demographics of them, and what are they getting from this game.
Of course. Sorry, I didn't do that previously. So Dressed is a styling game. You go in and we have both like fashion directors and game designers working together to create challenges where you kind of show off your digital style, IRL style digitally. So what that means is these collaborations that I mentioned with luxury brands, we kind of bring in new pieces from their collections. And then we have fashion writers write up like real briefs that you might get from a magazine or, if you're working at a fashion house saying like, style, this sort of check print is really hot for fall winter, like style that on a model, and show off what that would look like. So then that's kind of the core loop. So then players can vote on each other's creations and say what they think is fashionable and what they think is not. And we have many exciting things in the pipeline that I can't tell you about of ways of expanding that, but that's kind of the core of what we do in the kind of core loop. And you mentioned there about the audience, and I think it's a really interesting thing too, where these sorts of games, like styling games and games about fashion, have always been made, actually. There have been, like, if you actually look back, like, all the way through, Barbie games for a very young audience back in the day, but then the dress-up doll games that some of you may know of from the likes of DeviantArt and back in the day, and all of these things have always played their part in the games industry. They might just not necessarily have been very well respected or understood. So it is actually this genre that has always had a big player base that we're just kind of expanding on and bringing to a new audience. What that means for us is primarily female, but we do get a lot of men playing as well. And we do have, I would also say, quite a broad age range that we target, kind of anywhere from kind of 20s into your 40s and 50s. But we're always expanding that and finding that out because I think everyone enjoys styling, or a lot of people do, if they find that creative tool.
Yeah, maybe not academics who are not renowned for their fashion sense, but like...
Hey, dark academia is a really big thing.
Dark
You just need to get on board with it.
Yes, I've heard of this. So, you know, and you gave yourself away a little bit. I should have mentioned that, like, you are a graduate of a games kind of degree, or games-oriented degree at a certain university. But when you use the term core loop, then you kind of give yourself away in that respect. Can you describe a little bit about, like, how you have realized the fantasy of being a stylist through the design of Dressed from a UX point of view? Because there's like the look of the day and the look radar kind of, there are also social features to a degree. So how does that kind of work?
Really good question. Because I think for me, you pointed out in that I am, yes, an Abertay graduate, said the word now. So I do come from mainly a games background, but I've always had a love for fashion. And one of the big things for me about joining Dress and really working in that fashion context for the first time in my life was all of these wild stories and cool things and ridiculously stupid things that happen in the fashion industry that I had no idea about. And yes, not all of it is Devil Wears Prada, but some of it is definitely, or might have used to have been back in the day. But I think it was a really important thing for us. And, you know, we're still working on it and like finding that right middle way between the two. Because I think people as players and those of us like who might not have worked in fashion, our first thoughts might be, oh yeah, Devil Wears Prada. Everyone's really mean. You know, everyone cares about being really thin. And it's all about, you know, like just showing off how much money. That's absolutely not what the fashion industry is these days. But there are some of those kind of Sex and the City, Carrie Bradshaw, being a writer and just writing a column and, you know, strutting around in Manolo Blahniks all day long. Some of that actually is very appealing as a fantasy. You know, it's not the sort of fantasy we would traditionally consider in games of, you know, yes, I'm an Elven Ranger level 20 and I, you know, sneak attack you. But there is almost like a real world fantasy of having this kind of glamorous fashion lifestyle. So for us and my team, it's really been that kind of trying to like pull those things from our lovely fashion colleagues of like, what actually makes this gorgeous? Is it the fact that there's this really tactile experience, apparently, not that I would know, when you're a fashion editor, of like, you just come back to your desk every day and it tends to be covered in flowers. It's like, oh, this person sent you flowers for going to the show. Here's this little personalized note because you did this thing. Here's this thank you because you worked with this person. Are those actually like user experience moments that we can take through into a game context, even though those wouldn't be traditionally represented in like the core loop of a game? So that's what we're trying to do, like really like not to replicate the kind of perhaps perceived negatives of the fashion industry, but actually take some of that fantasy that I think a lot of people do want to live and bring it to life in the game.
Awesome, thank you so much for that. And just to Jade now, because to widen the lens a little bit from luxury fashion, which is what Dressed kind of does and brings it into the gaming space. Avakin Life has like a bit of a broader palette of scenarios and uses that people are kind of, because it's like a massively multiplayer experience. Can you tell us a little bit about, and you have like a super interesting team and role. Can you tell us a bit about the platform, the player base, and your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think perhaps coming back from Caitlin's conversation, our user base really loves luxury fashion. We really see it, you know, it's very, very popular within our game. But yeah, so I'd kind of, how do I describe Avakin? So I'd say we're in that metaverse world right now. That's where we're like, you know, aligning ourselves to be. So most metaverses require a substantial level of gaming literacy, from understanding how to use a controller through to understanding sometimes the complex terminology and background information. So we like to think that, you know, we are different. We're a mobile metaverse, and we when we want to make exploring and enjoying the metaverse as simple as any other experience on your phone. So making it the perfect game for brands to reach out, to reach the wider audiences. So yeah, we've got like 60% of our user base is female. We've got 61% of that is Gen Z. We do target more of a broader range. Obviously, we've got male clothing, female clothing in there. So yeah, it creates focus in terms of content that we aim to offer within our platform. However, we always want to like aim to evolve and create and encourage a wider range of assets and deliverables to achieve, more importantly, a diverse experience. So we offer a huge range of content, from streetwear to goth to cosplay, role play content. I design wings. It's amazing. That enables our users to really define and explore how they want to present themselves within the platform. So my work personally involves creatively directing the fashion content and supporting other areas. So gosh, that's within the production of Avakin, working alongside the experience design, environments and animations, game framework. Essentially, though, I'm reviewing creatives within my team. We are a fashion team within the games industry. I think we are one of the first coming into the games industry, and I'm really proud of that. And I've got an excellent array of people that have joined into this team. So yeah, I work with them on setting briefs, working on the ideation phases, and working towards building better and upcoming solutions within our approaches to fashion and content for the future of Avakin within the metaverse, which is why I'm really happy to be a part of this conversation, because I think it's really important that we're kind of feeding and learning off each other in this new territory.
Yeah, it's super interesting being, the first in this kind of, or at least, one of the first as far as we can tell.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about like the process in the Avakin fashion team for designing new looks, assets and virtual items, and, what are the different roles that you've got in the team?
Yeah, so, gosh, a forever hotbed of innovation. Like fashion is forward thinking and recurrent, with fast fashion creating an instant gratification mentality and the rise of like see now, buy now culture. Gaming offers that quick fix of immediate indulgence with an incredibly quick production turnaround, I dare say, from design creation to instant publish at a press of a button. Another thing I dare say, my publishing team probably would disagree with bugs and all that, but we have over 80 million virtual transactions per month. So that is a huge and growing, exciting like library of content that we've got. That we're looking at adapting and we can play with via featuring in events and areas within Avakin. So that brings me to like where this shows the growing rate in which the industry is starting to open fashion and games related careers. So, visual merchandising, fashion production roles, to even makeup and hair designs are all areas that we've personally covered within the team. My team have a retail past experience within the, let's say, high street fashion. And then I've got them creating wings and hairstyles. So yeah, it's there are those avenues there opening now, which is really incredibly exciting. Styling the Avakins, all our marketing artwork it's primarily done by us as a team, and we deliver that to our creative services team. So there's a lot of opportunities there. But primarily my team, we actually, for speed and ease, we're actually quite traditional based. A lot of 2D design, obviously, within the realms of Adobe, but we do mix that with digital tech. So, we are looking at, we work on Marvelous Designer and all of those programs and tools. And then we have our character artists who are incredible at achieving and bringing to life our virtual life content, fashion content that we publish twice weekly on the platform. So yeah, we don't necessarily have like a mass production in a game, but one asset, we can create that with possibility of multiple reiterations on textures at a low cost to conception. So this is a sustainable approach. I'm not, we want to further look into that, but for an ever mindful Gen Z consumer, the brands and designers should take hold of and embrace. So yeah, we kind of achieved this from reflecting the real world into like virtual landscape, but we want to expand and approach dynamically. That's really important to us. We want to kind of keep informed, when we're doing our trend research. We have to be updated, we have to be on the pulse, like thinking to the future, reflecting on the past. We do look at a lot of luxury fashion. We take our inspiration from an absolute array, a mass. Like we are looking at so much imagery daily. It's quite a lot. We're trying to cover all aspects of everything. So we like to approach our design dynamically, playfully. Try not to keep things too serious. Like that one killer item could very well be a set of demon eyes or a furry set of slippers.
That kind of like raises the question of like, how do you design for such a range of activities that players get up to? And, you know, there've been virtual concerts. So, you know, club wear, streetwear, casual kind of wear, as we're kind of like coming out into the world, again, IRL, like what have you kind of like noticed about the changes that have happened recently, and how do you design for such a diverse game, you know, culturally as well?
Yeah, I think, you know, we have our community team here. They do such an impressive job in engaging and listening to our user base. So feedback is can be extremely essential. You know, connecting to our user base is really important. You have to be ready to be dynamic with approaches to content, and like I said, keeping on the pulse of trends. So we're always looking, researching, analysing. This is globally, you know, our large user base is primarily in Brazil, so we have support their employees within Lockwood that can, you know, kind of put together packs and information packs on where we should be looking for this. Like, for instance, we offer Brazil Carnival, in game, and you know, I want to kind of understand that more for next year. And you know, I've learned recently that there are many different carnivals within Brazil, and it's all about kind of pulling that together and listening. So yeah, trends. We know our user base they're peacocks. They like to show off their purchases. We have to kind of aim to create that curve of desire within there, and then we know that we've got, you know, personas from our user research. So we've got like the likes of social fashionistas, connected companions. We have the influencers, and then the solo designers. You know, I was always one of them on Sims. Relaxed explorers. Yeah, we have to just kind of. It is a juggling game to try and tick all those boxes. So, yeah, I mean, we've done this in the past. I think. Talking about kind of getting luxury brands in game, we actually have touched on last year, 2020, the year of working from home, when it all began. We started approaching fashion designers for our fashion month. So we actually looked at, you know, students, graduates, up and coming 3D designers. We created this fashion altered space within the platform that was an experience. It wasn't just a runway, which we'd offered before. It was like a immersive experience that kind of, you went through this canyon space, and there was artwork on the walls and interactions, interactive furniture, and then obviously like the live ops event in game. And we had drops of each of these designers over, I think, 3 weeks. So, you know, fulfilling a very enriched content. And then our community team worked with these designers and was hosting like live Q&A sessions over on the socials and things, which was brilliant to kind of see that together. So yeah, we're always working on evolving, and you know, we don't aim to just work with luxury brands. We definitely have, I can't talk about it, but lots of exciting things coming in the future.
Awesome, man. I think that feeds like super well into to Ruth's work with Fashion Revolution. And just to kind of give you a set, like you've said that you're not a gamer, or like, you know, this is kind of like not your kind of like native sort of field. But obviously Fashion Revolution has really taken digital culture as an area of activism and advocacy. So I was just thinking, you know, when I heard that you would be part of the panel, like we recently gave a task to our computer arts students where we're, you know, asking them to develop something creative around a social issue of their choice. And a whole bunch of them, like we didn't prime them at all. Just so many of them did projects around fast fashion and sustainability. So I can guarantee that the next generation of games makers are really concerned about these kinds of issues. Can you tell us a bit about Fashion Revolution and what key issues you see as part of what you've addressed in your work?
Sure. So yeah, I wanted to give a PSA that I am learning so much from everyone here because I'm really not a gamer myself. Fashion Revolution is the world's largest fashion activism community. We're all about using social media as a tool for change, but kind of digital fashion and gaming, that's a whole other thing. And, you know, we were talking pre-panel about gaming being used as a kind of marketing tool for brands. But what I'm not so aware of is how can we get the, you know, sustainable fashion message out through those mediums. And I think it's a really exciting area. I get quite jaded about where we are in the fashion industry. Just as a kind of long story short, the fashion industry is built on the exploitation of workers and the environment. We have too much stuff. That's the key problem. That's what drives it all. Digital fashion has been touted as the kind of solution to that. You know, could we not, instead of having real clothes, could we have digital clothes? I'm not sure how we can walk around in daily life in digital clothes, but it's a really interesting area. And I think fashion has always driven innovation. You know, the first computer was a weaving loom. The Industrial Revolution was driven by factories making garments. So it excites me that fashion is kind of getting involved in this. But from the perspective of Fashion Revolution, we're really trying to do the opposite of selling stuff and selling brands, and actually getting people, everyday people, consumers, citizens, people who are gamers, to hold brands accountable for what they're doing wrong, and to hold the fashion industry accountable for what it's doing wrong. So it's a kind of whole new world, but I'm really interested in how those areas can intersect.
So, I mean, that's where maybe, because I know Caitlin and Jade are like super concerned with these issues as well. That's maybe where that can be like a real kind of learning experience from the path that Fashion Revolution has blazed using digital culture. So given that, like, what are some of the key techniques that you've used, and can you relate them to maybe some possibilities from what you've heard today, or you know, what are your thoughts? And then we'll go wide, like Jade and Caitlin, if you want to like kind of jump in as well.
So, I mean, social media is where the movement was born back in 2013, and that's still the tool we use. I'm the comms manager. I use social media every day, and before that I was using social media to talk about sustainability too. But it's pretty low tech, I would say. It's really a case of how much noise can we make about this issue? Can we make this noise on Instagram, TikTok? Can we email brands, flood their inboxes? These are like really simple digital activism tools that most NGOs are using. What's interesting to me is how do we use more high-tech digital tools to educate gamers about sustainability. For example, like when I was prepping for this panel, I watched a TED talk by Jane McGonigal about how can we use gaming, you know, to make social change. Like, can we use it to, instead of selling stuff about activism, about raising awareness of social issues in the fashion industry, perhaps not in a really like, you know, do-gooder kind of way, but in a really engaging way. Because at Fashion Revolution, you know, we're not saying that fashion is bad. We love fashion. Like, I love fashion. I studied fashion. I always wanted to work in luxury fashion. We can use it instead as a tool for change. And what interests me is, you know, this idea of expressing ourselves through virtual worlds. How can we bring that into the real world, where fashion is a real tangible product? The fashion supply chain is, you know, one of the most labor intensive supply chains in the world. We can't 3D print most garments because it's so labor intensive to sew fabric. We can't make, robots don't make our clothes, which I think some consumers maybe assume they are because everything else is made by robots. Still millions and millions of people, 1 in 6 people in the world, work some way related to the fashion supply chain. So how can we take this conversation about digital fashion being the future of fashion into the real world of, you know, a garment worker is sewing the t-shirt that you buy and wear. So for me, it's exciting, but I struggle to kind of make those connections of the real tangible supply chain in fashion and what, you know, Gucci is doing, or, you know, Louis Vuitton is doing, or Balenciaga is doing in the gaming world, which seems quite niche. I'm interested to hear your thoughts anyway.
Yeah, and if I could speak to that one, because I think it's also kind of that crossover, right, of like games for good and games for change, and how like gameplay can affect your real behavior in the real world. Because I think there's almost two paths, right? There's like just replicating kind of like the real world, like beautiful pieces of fashion in a video game context, and then there's like, does your game stand for something, and how are our players going to take that through into their daily life? And for us, that's, and before I go, and it's not going to be a dress spiel, right? But I will talk to some of the things that we've done in this space. But I would just say previously, from my experience, like as a game designer and as a games person, it's really hard to tie those two together. It's really hard to actually like make meaningful change through games, because it's such you have like both the kind of the player perceptions of like, I'm doing this for fun. I don't want to be lectured to. I don't, this is my time to relax. This is my time for fantasy. I kind of don't need any of that. So there's that combination of that with actually knowing that like interactive media and things like games where you actually are able to engage with it in a meaningful way can be one of the best ways of creating like social change, especially when we look to digital natives and younger generations where like, over lockdown, Discord and games were how kids communicated and had social interactions. This is like how so many people are growing up. So it's like such an important part. So for us, number one, there's absolutely more that can be done, and we're working on this. It's probably similar to Jade. It's like there's lots of stuff going on in the background. But for us, we have like a commitment to kind of highlighting sustainable brands and also like Black-owned brands. We think it's actually very important for fashion advocacy to go together. So we have that part as like a core part of our offering, but also in kind of actually supporting various kind of like charitable causes and things through it. However, without giving away any spoilers or breaking any NDAs, I think there's a lot there of like, again, when we talk to this like fashion of fantasy and the reality of like when you're working in the industry and not just kind of consuming everything and not worrying about it, there's a lot of people that really do care about these things and are wanting to change it. And so I think one of our big paths going forward is actually bringing that fashion education almost through the fantasy piece into the game experience. So, that's whether that's actually like teaching people on like through challenges or through the kind of moment to moment gameplay of like, here is kind of like what the actual steps are for like getting a bunch of pieces to choose which ones are going to go into a collection or things like this. And I think that's kind of like a really great place where the two can intersect of actually finding ways that, it's going to be engaging to a player and it's going to be something they'll care about, but they'll also learn something through it and it might affect their day-to-day behavior.
So Jade, I think we may be through into Q&A soon. I assume Safi will appear when we're ready to do that, but
okay.
You want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I think definitely, I know we're consciously going into the new year, looking at addressing these issues. We've got Gen Z and the next generation, obviously completely aware of what's going on. We can't be silent, but we also need to engage our players. They do join, they want to be social, they want to interact and talk and kind of switch off a little bit into this metaverse, but there is a responsibility of businesses, especially within the games industry and platforms, that we have to kind of, consciously take this on board. It's very difficult in an asset sense. We've thought about, how could we kind of promote this? Is there a way we can recycle our content in a sense where it is, we're kind of creating that educational space. We're looking towards that. I think, everyone, all the members of Lockwood, feel it's important to kind of, raise the awareness and keep the conversation going, because ultimately that is the most important thing, communication around this.
That's super interesting. I'm thinking back to the games that I played as a teenager, like The Sims, and how there'd be like a H&M stuff pack and things like that, and like fashion designer games. And sustainability was never really part of that. So it's definitely a huge area of opportunity.
Yeah. And I think it's a fascinating, like, it's something I really care about kind of outside of work as well. But I think there's that really interesting crossover of like, especially Gen Z and like younger generations that again might not have a lot of money to spend on very lovely sustainable clothing that has been, very well produced and, has a proper supply chain. They might not have the money to spend on that, but they might really care about it. And so it's like, what ways can you actually allow those people to engage with sustainability? And are there actually ways they can do that in the virtual space, even if in real life, really, they can only afford the H&M jumper, they have to buy it? Or are there ways you can teach about thrifting and online shopping and all these things that can have less an impact on the environment?
And we're I can't say anything like Caitlin, break of NDA and things like that, but we're in talks with businesses, and we're ideating at the moment. Like we're in this space of like, how do we go about this? It's watch this space.
Well, thanks everyone, and it's great because it's time for the Q&A, and I have a question on this subject actually. So, a similar subject. Well, thank you very much everyone for your participation, and thanks Darshana for hosting. So the first question is, so how do we get mass/global participation? Looking at the economic divide, can digital fashion help bridge the economic gap, or could it make the divide bigger? It's a big question, but is digital fashion helping making fashion more accessible, or is it the opposite?
I think there's a lot of conversation about making fashion accessible, and one thing that's missing from that conversation is the people who make our clothes. Obviously, there's this idea that's been pushed by brands that sustainability is something that we can buy, but that's not true. The most sustainable thing you can do is not to buy. So I think when it comes to digital fashion and the idea that, oh, maybe, you could access a luxury product that you couldn't normally access, it kind of misses the point of accessibility and who's really winning in this big, not to make it really meta, but the big brands controlling the conversation. I'm not sure how I feel about, an NFT being more accessible than a physical garment, when at the crux of it, we still have millions of people working in the fashion supply chain who would never be able to access these garments to start with. So I just wanted to get that in before we go off track.
No, and it's such an important thing. It is. I think it's almost like the daily struggle of anyone kind of like working in a tech space, even like in like the UK, right? It's like, how do you kind of reconcile that, like the real world impact that everything you do, this computer that I speak to you on, probably there was rare metals mined within it for like possibly by children somewhere. Like there's so many impacts in what we do, and the fashion one obviously is like massively very relevant today, especially with what we're speaking about. And from my perspective, I have kind of 2 points, and one of them is when we speak specifically about digital fashion, when we look at like, again, that metaverse, like we're all walking around in VR and wearing VR clothing. I think I don't know if it was you, Ruth, or someone else pointed out, like, what are we going to be wearing when we walk down the street? We're always going to have a need, unless we have a nudist revolution. There's always going to be a need for some sort of like something to clothe our bodies with and something to do in the digital world. But my kind of big question would be like, how important will it be to practice like self-representation in real clothing, and like spend loads of money and loads of resources on like having the newest Gucci bag or the newest nice high street version of it, or whatever it is. I know these are all they're all just as impactful on the planet as each other, right? But like, how important will that be as we move more into kind of like mixed reality universe, where what we present online and what we do online might be in some ways like how we interact with the world for a lot of elements? And then when you look at that space, are there ways that can be constructed so that it's not just like, oh, anyone can buy a designer bag, but are there ways that like we don't have to replicate the kind of fashion production chains that have kind of gone into the kind of creation of real world garments? Yeah, that's an open question, honestly.
I think kind of in the realms of where I'm working at Avakin is this whole like kind of rework and repurpose. So we're trying to like look at UGC and ways that we can approach that. And it's let's kind of look at fashion that in actual fact, vintage and charity shop and upcycling your clothing, that's having a huge resurgence at the moment. You look at Depop and the success of that. How can we kind of bring that in? And there's an education right there. Do you have to go and buy new? Can't you restyle, maybe create something, crafts big? Like there is space to start thinking creatively about how we can go about this and essentially kind of, maybe battle that fast fashion chain.
And I think there's a huge thing there also about like the culture that you learn online is reflected into your everyday culture as well. And it's like, if you're introducing concepts, even the concept of sustainability or like thinking about where your clothes are coming from, if you introduce that to people in a context they might not be expecting it, that might actually cascade into the way that they think the real world again, it's just about, making that engaging and fun, and also kind of like balancing it with your different gameplay elements. But like digital culture is it's not a fake thing, it's real. So it really can affect how people act.
That was a fantastic array of answers. So thank you very much, everyone. Unfortunately, we only had time for one question, but it was very insightful.
There's lots
Thank
to
you
talk
all.
about. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. That was awesome. Ciao.